Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe and keep watching more details. Chicago Fire, Med, and PD are about to take yet another break. Following the successful One Chicago crossover event, which brought about season-high ratings for Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD, one would assume NBC would want to capitalize on the momentum the three-part event gave the franchise. However, that does not seem to be the case. In announcing its primetime schedule for the upcoming weeks, NBC has revealed the One Chicago shows will be airing new episodes the first week of February before taking yet another break, this time one that's a bit more planned. As announced via the released schedule, fans can indeed expect new episodes of all three One Chicago shows on February 5. However, Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD will all be in reruns on February 12, with no new episodes planned for the hit series. What remains unclear at this point is whether NBC is planning for a one-week break, or if we could be in store for a longer hiatus. This is because NBC has only released its primetime lists through the week of February 10, which makes it hard to know if Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD will be simply taking 1 week off, or whether the shows might be in reruns for a few weeks. We should have confirmation of how long this particular hiatus will be when the promos for episode 13 of the One Chicago shows drop, as the promos should indicate the exact date the shows will return. Interestingly, February is a quieter month for the One Chicago franchises, with NBC often scheduling a break for Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD during the second month of the year. In fact, we've seen the show taking at least 1 week off during the month of February every year since 2020. The only thing that has varied with the show's February breaks has been their duration. Last season, the One Chicago shows were off the air for just 1 week in February, with all three shows taking the second week of February off before resuming their seasons in the third week of the month and airing new episodes for the remainder of February. However, in the 2 previous years, the shows took larger breaks in the month, airing just 1 new episode in February. This is all to say there is a high probability that Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD might go on a multi-week break following their February 5 episodes. As disappointing as this might sound, the reason networks such as NBC have to work in the occasional multi-week hiatus is due to the need to stretch out 18 to 22 episodes over the course of 9 months via the standard September to May broadcast cycle. No matter how long this break ends up lasting, the good news is that fans can still enjoy binging their favorite episodes via Peacock, and we know we'll at least be getting 1 new episode this February. The wind was cutting through the streets of Chicago as the wind chill dropped, signaling the beginning of yet another winter break for the beloved trio of TV shows, Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, and Chicago PD. The crew at Firehouse 51 had just wrapped up their latest rescue, and there was a sense of accomplishment in the air, but also an underlying sadness. The break wasn't just a pause in production, it felt like a real break in their lives, a reminder of how fleeting moments could be in their high-stakes world. In the break room of Firehouse 51, the atmosphere was quieter than usual. Most of the firefighters had scattered home to their families, while a few of the regulars stayed behind to clean up or finish paperwork. Among them was Lieutenant Kelly Severide, whose steely eyes were focused on his paperwork, but his mind was elsewhere. With the long break ahead, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the upcoming time off. "Penny, for your thoughts?" came a voice from the door. It was his best friend and paramedic partner, Matt Casey. Severide looked up, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "What's with the sudden interest in my thoughts?" Matt leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm just wondering if you're going to spend the break sulking in that chair like you always do." "Not sulking," Severide replied, throwing a glance toward the window where snowflakes began to swirl in the sky. "Just thinking." Matt rolled his eyes but knew better than to push. They both understood how hard it was to take a break from the adrenaline-filled world they lived in. Time off from the firehouse wasn't just time away from work, it was time away from the purpose that fueled their days. "I'm headed home. Gotta spend some time with Sylvie," Matt said, a touch of warmth in his voice. "You know, before we go back to the madness." Severide nodded. "Enjoy it, Casey, you deserve it." Meanwhile, across town in the emergency room at Gaffney Chicago Medical Center, Dr. Will Halstead was finishing up a shift that had been anything but quiet. The ER was packed, and the pressure never let up. His eyes were tired, but there was a satisfaction in knowing that despite the chaos, he had helped save lives. "Will, you heading out?" A voice called from behind him. It was Dr. Natalie Manning, his colleague and the woman he had spent years working alongside. Will turned and smiled tiredly. "Yeah, finally. What about you?" "Just wrapping up a few things. I'll be gone in a minute," Natalie said. She paused for a moment, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "How about you? Any big plans for the break?" Will ran a hand through his hair, letting out a sigh. "Not much. I guess I'll catch up on some sleep, maybe visit my brother. The usual." "That sounds like a good plan," Natalie said with a reassuring smile. "Just make sure you take it easy. We both know how hard it can be to get back into the swing of things after time off." "I'll try," Will said, knowing that the thought of time away from the hospital made him uneasy. But like everyone else, he needed to recharge, even if it was just for a few days. The sounds of the hospital continued to echo around them, but it was clear that both doctors had the same thought in mind. The break was inevitable. Even though it would be nice to have a moment to breathe, they both knew that the intensity of their jobs was always just around the corner, waiting to demand their full attention once again. Elsewhere, Detective Hank Foyt was sitting alone in his office at District 21, reflecting on the case he had just wrapped up. His usually stern expression had softened, but only slightly. He was a man who thrived on the chaos of the job, who lived for the chase and the satisfaction of closing a case. But even Voight couldn't deny that the time off was a necessary evil. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up with a sigh. It was a message from his partner, Detective J. Halstead. "Break is here. What's the plan?" Voight's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. He thought about it before typing back, "Keep it low-key. We'll catch up after the break." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, looking at the framed photos of his team on the wall. They were his family in a way, and he knew that even though they would all be off for a while, the work would pull them back together soon enough. The break would end quickly, as it always did. Jay, for his part, was feeling the weight of the break as well. He'd been working hard for weeks, pushing through case after case, and though he appreciated the time off, it was hard to imagine life without the constant rush of action. His brother Will had invited him to spend some time together, and though Jay wasn't sure he was ready to let go of the adrenaline, he knew it would be a good opportunity to unwind. "I'll be back at it before I know it," Jay muttered to himself as he grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. The detective turned off the lights in his office and made his way to the door, his thoughts still lingering on the cases left behind. As the city of Chicago settled into the winter lull, the Chicago family found themselves facing the inevitable quiet of the break. There was no call to race out the door at a moment's notice, no life or death situations to deal with, and no criminals to chase. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could take a breath. But even in those moments of silence, they knew the job would always be waiting for them. It was a job they couldn't walk away from, no matter how many breaks they took. And with each new break, they understood that the true bond of their team wasn't in the chaos. They were a family because they would always return to each other, no matter how far apart they got. As the snow continued to fall, the city held its breath, and so did the team. And for now, that was enough.